I wish I was the monster you think I am. I wish I had enough poison for the whole pack of you. I would gladly give my life to watch you all swallow it.
Tyrion Lannister is a complicated character with a lot of iconic quotes. I think his first great quote from the books and the show alike is actually his advice to Jon Snow, a proud young man who can't stand being called a bastard. Despite his typical mocking attitude, Tyrion tells him,
"Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armour, and it can never be used to hurt you."
Why am I starting the video straight off with this? It's because it is, in a way, brilliant advice for Jon Snow, or for anyone, depending on the situation and how exactly you interpret that quote. To the extent just googling the quote comes up with endless different articles and blog posts people have written about the wisdom of the quote. Business Insider, Psychology Today, Geek Wisdom, so on. And I find it kinda hilarious because whilst all these articles are definitely partly correct, this advice and worldview also underpins pretty much everything that goes wrong for Tyrion in the books. It's an attitude that kinda cements his own downfall. We'll get to that later though. I am a therapist. I have made tons of videos analysing the psychology and behaviour of characters in the past. Recently I did a video on Tywin Lannister. Now we're talking about Tyrion, who is much more complicated I think to discuss due to the fact he is completely different in the books to how he is in the show. For which I'm going to focus this video much more on the book version, but it should still be understandable if you only know the show. Just, you need to know that going in though. As ever, please add your own thoughts in the comments, things I miss out and everything, because there is so much to try and fit into a single video. And that's the best thing about YouTube comments, how they can add to a video. But yeah, apart from that, let's get going. Let's start with the blindingly obvious, shall we? Tyrion is a dwarf in a world that looks down on dwarfs like they are some wretched creatures to either ridicule or be disgusted by. He is humiliated, shamed, dehumanised simply for who he is, made much worse by the fact his father adds even more shame and disgust, blaming him for the death of Tyrion's own mother, Joanna, and seeing him as the bane to Tywin's pride. When other people treat you like someone disgusting or tell you you're a vile creature, it's very, very hard not to end up at least partly feeling that about yourself. And I don't just mean ugliness there, but also badness. An ugliness not just of appearance, but of who he is inside. The two are kind of seen as a reflection of each other here. People tend to say when we are seen as bad or treated as bad that we end up becoming bad ourselves, and I think I'm paraphrasing a much more eloquent quote there, but I don't think that's entirely true. I don't think we become bad, whatever bad even means. That's a question of its own. I don't think people necessarily do, but they are given a very big internal pressure that can then push them in that direction. Because you do end up with this doubting voice in your head saying, what if everybody is right about me? What if Tywin is right? What if I am horrible? What if it is my fault my mum died? What if the gods made me a dwarf as punishment for how vile I truly am? Doubts that might be particularly strong in childhood as well, but Tyrion's a rational man. He rationally knows some people are just dwarf. It's not realistically a punishment, that's just how the world happens to be. Rationally, I think he knows his dad is also pretty horrible, let's say. That his dad is unfair to treat him the way he does, and he might logically understands that, but it doesn't remove the part of him that also feels the opposite. If understanding something rationally was enough to heal, therapy would be very easy. You'd just tell someone it's not your fault and that would be the end of it. You know, it might be good to tell someone that, but it doesn't resolve everything. The point is, what do you do when you've grown up partly believing you might be a bad person? Whatever you take that to mean, I think that depends on you. Unable to win your family's approval here, impossible for anyone to possibly love you, someone who makes the world a worse place. Part of you then might naturally want to fight against that idea and prove, no, I'm not a monster. So you might be keen to help out a wayward Jon Snow, which itself is interesting in how he helps him, partly offering kindly advice and generally looking out for him, but also partly taunting and insulting him at the same time, which I guess is in a very small way getting to do both things at once, help and also project his own humiliated feelings onto another. And he's very keen to make a saddle for Bran, enjoying how he proves Robb Stark's mistrustful opinions of him wrong. I think generally you can even say the way Tyrion deliberately sets himself apart from his family, the rational part of him that says, I'm not the monster, my father is, if anyone, my scheming evil sister. I'm a good person who actually cares about the weak. And so, by setting himself up as completely different to him, he can project all the negative feelings back their way. They are horrible to people, he is kind. I can even be kind. Kindness is not a habit with us Lannisters, I fear, but I know I have some somewhere. And so he's quite keen to be different in lots of ways. They'll be proud and dignified Lannisters, so I'll spend my time in brothels and taverns instead. I guess it's even spending time in the complete opposite places to them. I'll go off talking to the Bastard of Winterfell or exploring the Wall. Arguably there could be a part of him thinking, it's also these high-born noble lords and ladies that look down on me the most that make me stick out like a sore thumb in contrast to them, so I'll spend my time with the low-born instead, the whores and cutthroats, the people where I look less out of place. Although, actually also the people where he gets to be one above them at the same time due to his riches and title. In fact, we'll get to that. Generally though, aside of Tyrion deliberately setting himself apart and probably relishing in how he can rebel against his father that way, Tywin doesn't want me sleeping with whores, so I'll do exactly that. There's two issues with all of this though. The first one is that Tyrion says he chose to help Bran because
I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples, bastards, and broken things.
The thing is, there's a difference between empathy and pity, I suppose. And when I look at a lot of Tyrion's kindly actions, I sometimes wonder if he leans more towards pity than genuine empathy. I don't know, you might disagree with this. Empathy is about having deep compassion and feeling for how someone else feels. Pity is more about feeling sorry. It's about having an understanding of how someone else feels and perhaps feeling bad for them, but not actually feeling their emotions yourself. I think it also can sometimes come with a power element to it as well, where in feeling sorry for them, they're placed lower down than you. I'm so sorry you're struggling with this bad thing that I'm not struggling with and am so much better than, you know? I kinda wonder if we get that with Tyrion. Perhaps hence his eagerness to taunt Jon Snow even as he helps him, and all makes him feel higher up than this bastard boy or this crippled Bran. Or I think in A Dance with Dragons he largely pities the dwarf Penny without ever truly understanding her strengths. I guess he kind of does, but when Tyrion has a tender spot in his heart for the weak, the suffering, the exploited, the vulnerable, it is because he knows how it feels to be vulnerable and humiliated, yes, but not because he wants to truly help them grow beyond those feelings so much as projects that side of himself onto them, getting to then both feel better than them, but also getting to feel good for helping them, getting to partly feel like he's helping and symbolically healing himself through the healing of another, I guess. Not truly healing, but the satisfactory illusion of it. I can talk more about that point if it's not clear, ask me in the comments. The other issue though with this side of Tyrion trying to do good, trying to prove not just to the world, but also critically to himself that he isn't a monster. In fact, I think when you factor in how his father has often stated he wanted Tyrion dead, it's also probably a quest to prove to himself that he deserves to exist, which is awful. You get in A Clash of Kings Tyrion's attempt to become the hero, partly. There are arguments against this statement that will become important later on, but while Tywin is off nobly burning innocent civilians to death, he names Tyrion to be Hand of the King in his stead. Why Tyrion? Tywin says it's because
you're my son.
Which is his usual manipulation to partly sucker Tyrion in, but I think it's largely because Tywin does know Tyrion possesses useful abilities, that his relationship with both Joffrey and Cersei already means he's not just going to be a yes man to them, and also I think Tywin believes that once he does return to King's Landing, he'll easily be able to sweep away any power Tyrion might have amassed in his absence. Either way, Tyrion has temporary but very real power, with which he plans the defence of King's Landing against the invaders, he saves the city, he even leads the charge himself of a rallying cry. He is, in many ways, certainly from his perspective, the hero of King's Landing. And even the motivations he talks about in the books are going to King's Landing to do justice, rather than all the scheming of others. You know, he'll beat them at their own scheming game, sure, but he'll do it for justice, such as replacing Janos Slynt for killing babies. And in his feverish state after the Battle of Blackwater, he dreams of a celebratory feast where he's hailed as the hero. His dad is even smiling with approval at him. And quite naturally, Tyrion's main hopes and motivations are the wish to be accepted by this world he's born into, not to be demonised by the Highborn, to win their approval, to be accepted by his father. This is what he wants. If Tyrion doesn't like feeling like the monster all the time, there's a limit to how much of a difference it can make by just doing small kind acts and showing pity to those more vulnerable, or broken as he puts it, than him. That's not going to change wider people's perception of him. Tyrion wants a greater external validation from others. Of course he wants his father's approval. The tragedy, however, is that even in that moment where he believes he has been the hero, proved he's the total opposite to the monster, even then he wins no approval at all. No one's opinion of him changes. The effect this all has on Tyrion, this rejection here, is absolutely massive. I should be clear, it's not just that Tyrion does something heroic in his eyes and doesn't win approval or acceptance for it. It's that he does something heroic, then is left alone to heal in a lonely chamber. His father takes all the credit, takes back the Tower of the Hands, the power, reaffirms his disgust for his son. All the allies Tyrion built up in King's Landing start to disappear. He is blamed for a murder he didn't commit, for which his father may or may not be intending to have him executed. His lover turns against him, and nobody at all speaks out on his behalf. That is as big as rejection ever gets. Everybody has rejected you, your family, your lover, your allies, and the society as a whole. Tyrion tried to be the hero and was met with people wishing his death. That must hurt a lot. And to begin with, Tyrion is a bit defeated here. Impotent might even be the word you'd use, especially in the context of his own father taking away all his power. To which I do think a good addition in the show is this scene between Olenna and Tyrion, where she tells him,
I was told you were drunk, impertinent, and thoroughly debauched. You can imagine my disappointment at finding nothing but a browbeaten bookkeeper.
I love the reaction on Tyrion's face there. It's a great addition to the show that underpins Tyrion's emotional state perfectly right now. Even his famous wits are left largely speechless against Olenna Tyrell here. Tyrion in himself feels reduced to nothing. You know, as much as David and Dan did some horrendous stuff with the story later on, when they still had decent guidelines around them and probably weren't burnt out working on it for so long without getting the sense to really have anyone else to come in and help them, when they had all that, they were capable of adding some pretty good, well-written scenes. But yeah, Tyrion in himself feels reduced to nothing here until he gets pushed too far, where he explodes wonderfully in the trial. Partly really because Tywin just can't help his added need to humiliate others, particularly his son, by bringing in Shay and turning her deliberately against him. He's just got to add that extra humiliation, hasn't he? I suppose I take all of this slow journey from failed heroics, long-suffering defeatism, then this bitter explosion of revenge, as Tyrion giving up on not being the monster. I think that's quite a simple, poetic, literary-based and psychology-based way to put it all in, but it's worth saying anyway. Instead, just embracing the role fully. If this is what they see me as, regardless of what I do, if I can't change that opinion, then screw it, I'll become that monster, I'll own it, I'll haunt them in revenge. Teach them what happens when you treat someone good as a monster. This is their doing, I'm going to get at them for it, you know? Which is a way of twisting it all on its head, and a way of giving him a huge feeling of power. The total opposite of impotence. No wonder this change is so appealing to him. What's more, there's a certain kind of liberation I think most villains would feel, or even talk about in certain stories, when they just let go of what society expects of them, what their own conscience expects, and choose instead to fight against it, basically. I'm going to be that monster and get the satisfaction of having my revenge against all of them, and also absolve myself of the guilt with the idea that they've made me into this, you know? In the show, Tyrion though comes out of all of this trial as still basically a good person, which makes his outburst there feel a little sudden and extreme. In the books though, I think he is a villain, and I think he's set to become increasingly brutal and villainous once he meets Daenerys. He could be perhaps a very bitter voice in her ear that will feed the more extreme, brutal sides of her character. He might be the one to bring that out of her. But we do have to recognise that Tyrion has been bitter and vengeful already. He has spent a childhood dreaming of killing both his sister and his father. In Book 1, he plots to reduce the Vale to ash in revenge against Lysa arresting him. He stamps on the Singer Marillion's hands, breaking all his fingers just because he makes fun of Tyrion. When Maester Pycelle shares his secret to the Queen, he has his clansmen scare him to the point of wetting himself, threatening to castrate him before shaving off his famous beard, stripping him of his title and throwing him into a cell. He humiliated Lancel, various others, and generally cannot contain himself from making many angry, extreme threats at people. Most obviously in threatening to geld the king.
Then you'll be fucking your own bride with a wooden cock.
Or telling Cersei all her joys will turn to ash.
Day will come when you think you're safe and happy, and your joy will turn to ashes in your mouth.
A very angry, vengeful side bursts out of Tyrion when he feels slighted. A side at complete odds with the supposedly composed, calm, empathetic, witty Joker. I think we can draw two things from all of this. One is that Tyrion cannot stand laughter any better than Tywin can, which is unsurprising. You know, not only would he have grown up inheriting Tywin's belief that being laughed at is a great insult and a sign of your weakness and it all needs to be crushed, but Tyrion would have also been forced to endure a horrendous amount of humiliation for being a dwarf, for supposedly killing his mother when she died in childbirth. There's even the theory that Tyrion is actually the child of King Aerys and Tywin's wife Joanna, which I don't think is going to be true, but there's certainly enough suspicion that Tywin might have partly worried that was the case, and that would add to his disdain for Tyrion. All of it makes humiliation a horrible, horrible experience to prevent at all possible costs. For which, yes, a lot of the time Tyrion tries to outwit others in response. That's his strength. He can't intimidate people physically, really, but he can turn mockery back on them. That feels good. That makes him feel powerful instead of powerless. My mind is a weapon. My brother has his sword, King Robert has his warhammer, and I have my mind. The problem is, outwitting people doesn't stop them, say, the way Tywin's death stare and brutal history would make anyone too afraid to laugh at him openly. Outwitting someone might shut them up in the short term, but it will also leave them angered, eager to retaliate somehow. They'll keep trying to one-up his great wits. Hence, no amount of smarts or slaps stop Joffrey from relishing a chance to try and humiliate Tyrion. Sure, he might be able to run rings around Joffrey verbally and others, but it won't stop them dumbly, repeatedly calling him imp. And when being called imp hurts Tyrion, he'll want to do more to stop that completely. Hence the rage. Of course Tyrion grew up with a hell of a lot of anger. The only way you wouldn't growing up in his situation was if it was all suppressed into an empty numbness or that kind of defeated impotency that we've already seen. I suspect his drinking also makes the rage worse, as does his father. As much as I said Tyrion wanted to be the hero as Hand of the King to earn approval and validation, really, much more than that, he wanted to lord it over people who have looked down on him. He wanted power over this world of the Highborn. The Dwarf, the monster, the one they laughed at, but now I hold it all. The power, the city, the girl. This is what I was made for, and gods forgive me, but I do love it. He wants power in a way that is very similar to what I talked about with Tywin in his video, but just subtly different. Tywin wants power to build up this image of himself and to deny anyone the opportunity to ridicule and poke holes in that image. Tyrion wants power, yes, to stop people ridiculing him, but also for the very personal pleasure of having power over these people. I think there's a stronger element of revenge there. Revenge not just against individuals like Marillion who mocked him or Lysa who imprisoned him, but also this general society that does, or he imagines to, look down on him. This general society he projects onto as a faceless, bullying enemy. That's, and because it does very much build up his ego to feel like the brilliant schemer, one step ahead of everybody. Hence how he's constantly telling himself how brilliant a job he's doing, to the extent he doesn't really notice any of his mistakes. Anyway, this was the second point to draw out. The side of Tyrion that wants to be more like Tywin. People generally fear Tywin the way Tyrion wants to be feared himself. Why? Because Tywin dials his aggression up to 100 whenever his ego is wounded and obliterates his enemies, so Tyrion tries to do the same. The example of threatening Cersei that all her joys will turn to ash is the perfect example. She has taken Alayaya captive, who she thinks is Tyrion's mistress at the time, and she's done it because she thinks Tyrion is deliberately trying to hurt her and send her sons away. She doesn't actually have Tyrion's mistress Shae, so it's not a great worry for him here. All Tyrion has to do was tell Cersei that was not his intention. He has to talk to her, try working with his sister, ease this rivalry here, but he doesn't like being slighted, and he wants to be the all-powerful Tywin who is in command of all interactions, so he resorts to aggressive threats instead. He does nothing to dissuade Cersei's paranoia, even though that would be good for him. He does nothing because he relishes the chance to hurt her and to try and make her fear him. I think the sibling rivalry between all three Lannisters is fascinating, but I think it would be better to talk about that in a video on Cersei in particular, so we'll leave that for there. Unlike Tywin, these threats don't work for Tyrion. Why? Well, for one, he is a dwarf who isn't physically intimidating. All his threats kind of just reaffirm people's belief that he's this vile, wretched creature. He's also no lord with true power, alongside which, despite his successes in battles, he's never going to be a battle commander that could, for example, reduce a whole castle to ruins or flood one and deliver on his threats so clearly in that way. And the rest of his behaviour, the drinking, the women, the lack of loyal allies to rally to his side can just make his threats look a bit small and ridiculous, even when they might not necessarily be. In that sense, the rage, the vengeful side, the part of him that gives into this monster rather than fights against it was always there. His change doesn't come from nowhere. Of course, Tyrion growing up has been left with rage and bitterness and, I should say, trauma, which may inform his explosive responses. People then react to that as though it proves he's a monster, which will again then make him feel even more doomed to this image people have thrust onto him. Whilst it's certainly not inevitable he'll become that, and I certainly don't like the phrase that the abused becomes the abuser, because he doesn't have to be. Things might actually have gone quite differently for him in this story. For now, there was another reason for me mentioning this more vengeful side of Tyrion. It's because at his trial where he is condemned for the murder of Joffrey that he obviously didn't commit, he declares,
I'm guilty of being a dwarf.
You're not on trial for being a dwarf.
Oh, yes I am.
the reason everyone is against him, everyone wants him dead, despite the good he has done, despite the role he has played as the hero, is because he's a dwarf. That certainly makes him a far easier target for other people's projection, yes, but it's not entirely true either. So this is a section of the video that I could have easily just titled, despite the show consistently telling you Tyrion is the smartest person in Westeros, whilst also showing through his foolish actions that he's the exact opposite. A Tyrion in the books was never actually meant to be seen as that smart to begin with. It's a very snappy title. It's all to say that Tyrion spends his time as Hand of the King feeling very smug about his accomplishments. seeing himself as a brilliant schemer who's unmatched in his ability to play the game. All the while, Varys and Littlefinger are kind of running rings around him, but Tyrion does do a lot of clever scheming things to get ahead. He replaces Janos Slynt as head of the City Watch, not for justice really, but because he wants someone he's in charge of as head of the City Watch, rather than someone in his sister's pocket. Which is also why he throws Pycelle in the dungeons, why he tries to get Lancel Lannister to spy for him, and various other changes. He does a lot of it in clever ways. He gets people like Bronn with other sellswords on his side, and the clansmen, and it all amasses him a great deal of power. Temporarily. We see often that Tyrion has a tendency to turn to mercenaries for support. It makes sense, because Tyrion has access to vast wealth, and he's not the Jaime Lannister sort who might be able to inspire loyalty, not readily anyway. Tyrion would have to spend a huge amount of time over the course of his life building up a very good reputation for himself, showing people a nobler side to himself, let's say, and even then it's going to be difficult. Buying sellswords are much simpler. Also, I just think emotionally, Tyrion likes sellswords because it's straightforward. He knows exactly what they want, and therefore knows exactly how to keep them on his side. It doesn't require complex manipulation and favour and all sorts else. Which I think is similar to what we see with women here. Tyrion turns to sex workers because he doesn't truly believe anyone would actually love him. He seeks out this half illusion of love. In that sense, it's unsurprising that he likewise turns to sellswords for friends, or at least allies. So that is true, but sellswords also have the massive disadvantage that they can be easily put aside and hold no true loyalty to Tyrion. As much as Bronn likes Tyrion, he won't fight for him as his champion against Gregor Clegane. Tywin cleverly makes Bronn a knight, giving him more than Tyrion himself can give him. More so though, all of Tyrion's threats, his vengeful acts, and eagerness to humiliate others the way he has been humiliated in the past, that all creates a hell of a lot of enemies. Pycelle becomes his enemy to even very petty degrees here, like deliberately dropping a scroll. His attempts with Lancel don't really work and make another possible enemy. Joffrey despises him due to Tyrion's treatment of him. Cersei also hates him, and as I said, Tyrion does nothing to dissuade her paranoia and rivalry. Whilst he may never have gotten on well with these people, they didn't necessarily need to bear a burning resentment towards him. Such a resentment that, of course, they speak against him at his trial. Of course, no one speaks on his behalf. Sure, it's still a farcical trial, but that's politics. Anyone's going to use anything they can against their enemies when they get the chance. Tyrion gives them so much ammunition to do so. In that sense, I think Tyrion ends up on trial as much for his own actions as for being a dwarf. The only true friend he has left by the end of this trial is his brother Jaime, and it doesn't take long for Tyrion to burn that bridge too. I talked a bit about the story of Tysha in my video on Tywin. It's a traumatic experience for both Tysha and Tyrion, and I can only imagine what Tyrion must feel about it, which is what I'm going to do, imagine what Tyrion must feel about it. A low-born girl he married, living 2 weeks of loving bliss until his father found out, had Jaime tell Tyrion she was a sex worker who never actually loved him before Tywin forced Tyrion to watch her be passed between all of his guards, then back to Tyrion, forced to have sex with her again in front of them, only this time obviously very little love. Tyrion felt incredibly humiliated and angry at his father about this. I don't need to even say that, of course he did. He probably also felt stupid and ashamed of himself, as though thinking, obviously Tysha didn't love me. Of course Jaime had paid her to pretend, how could I be so stupid? He might have felt embarrassed for believing her and being so vulnerable with her when it was a trick, which then might have turned to anger towards Tysha herself. That feeling that she'd tricked him. It might not have done, but that's certainly possible. Tyrion might have felt angry at himself for believing it was love, and it all would have been an experience to tell him, nobody will ever love you. It's not possible. You're a fool for even wanting to believe it. Don't believe in love. Although of course it means more than that to Tyrion. It's not just believing in love, it's believing in the idea that someone can accept him for who he is. Believing that he's deserving of existence, of love, of being there. That's a huge amount of feeling and emotional weight to place on a relationship with another person, but of course, you know. And I wonder if this explains part of his controlling nature towards Shae. She is quite a capable girl who challenges him, particularly in the show. But in the books, Tyrion slaps her, he is a bit more controlling, and whilst he does eventually decide to marry her off for her own safety, it takes him a great deal longer to come to that decision, rather than the noble act of trying to get her free in the show. If nobody will ever truly love him, as much as he tries to convince himself that Shae loves him, in the books she never does, but he so tries to convince himself because he desperately wants to believe. Despite that, he can't quite trust her and wants to keep her close and controlled. But I imagine more than anything, the Tysha experience left Tyrion with a mass amount of guilt. Guilt for two possible things. One being that if he hadn't foolishly married her, she'd never have suffered such horrible trauma. The second guilt is that if a side of Tyrion did hate Tysha, probably unconsciously hated her for the experience, whilst also still loving her at the same time. Perhaps he even chose to hate her to spare himself missing her quite as much. It would seem all his feelings are a conflicted, muddled mess of lots of things: love, anger, sadness, hatred, embarrassment, shame. But if a side of him did hate or even feel anger towards Tysha, how intensely guilty that then must have left him when he eventually found out that she wasn't a sex worker, that she did genuinely love Tyrion. Jaime had just been forced to lie under Tywin's orders. Finding out that means he'd spent years upon years feeling anger towards the only person who ever loved him. Years upon years not searching for her, condemning her memory. It's an intense guilt. It's then unsurprising how he flips to the complete opposites, idealising Tysha to the absolute max as though to make up for his previous anger. Probably also out of a desperate hope to go back to the way things were. And also probably a level of splitting between his two big relationships with women. Tysha is the idealised good one, Shae is the bad one who betrayed him and drew out his murderous rage. An absolute split between the two there. The thing I find perfect for Tyrion's story is the introduction of Penny in that sense, a dwarf just like him for which they built up a level of friendship. However, Tyrion has no interest in anything further. He's got this idealised image of Tysha to chase instead, and he just prefers to keep her as someone to pity, someone I think it seems like he's increasingly becoming harsh and dismissive towards, although we have to wait for Winds of Winter to actually be released before we can know for sure. At the very least, she reflects Tyrion's split feelings here between someone good to partly admire. I think he does sort of admire her, and then also a side of her that reminds him of Shae and draws out his anger. That makes it all very difficult for Tyrion to truly get close, not necessarily romantically either. Tysha, I guess, in that sense is the closest thing Tyrion ever had to a good female role model, because he never knew his mum, and Cersei was certainly not a good example as an older sister. Shae, in the end, betrays him. Who else has there been? Despite some flaws, I think Penny could have a positive effect on Tyrion. I think that's possible. I think she shows his potential to possibly change for the good. She is not chained to her pride and insecurities like Tyrion. She is not compelled to say what she likes to people the way Tyrion can't help mocking and leads himself into trouble. She could really give him the chance to come to terms with who he is as a dwarf and a person, not hating himself for it. But I think his feelings of women are too I don't know what the word is, trouble, I guess, to really let her have an effect on his heart. Again, not necessarily romantically. Plus, instead, he has this idealised dream of Tysha, who, even if he found her again, would not be able to pick up where they left off, probably. I expect she'd want nothing to do with him. But they only knew each other for 2 weeks. As much as I say she might have been a good female role model, that's no time at all. Perhaps that's me even putting a load of idealisation onto her based on Tyrion's idealisation. Maybe I'm getting caught up in his thoughts there. Tyrion likes Penny, but he doesn't truly want to be like Penny, I guess you can say. Even now, he still wants to be like Tywin. Perhaps in the same way Tywin doesn't want to think he is anything like Tyrion. Tyrion doesn't want to think he is like Penny. I don't know, I need to reread their scenes to think about that more. Let me know what you think. For now, let's move on. I said the advice to make your weakness your armour was kind of at the heart of Tyrion's downfall, or descent anyway. Such advice could be good if it meant recognising the strengths within your weaknesses, accepting them for that and trying to build on it. Most weaknesses are also a strength in many ways. For Tyrion though, it seems to more mean shielding himself against the rejection. Not even just fronting that you don't care about people's insults, which can be okay, but needing a real armour to defend yourself in a way that just teaches you the dwarfism is something he should feel bad about, is something he needs to deeply defend against. I hope that makes sense. It's quite a subtle but important difference. Many rejections he has suffered consistently across his life to the point he quite understandably struggles to bear it anymore. How do you go on then, trying your absolute hardest to be a good person, to set yourself apart from your family, to be accepted by the world as someone noble and worthy of belonging, if your every painstaking attempt to do so only leads to further crushing rejection? That's incredibly hard, so he forges a lot of shields and armour, fronting his humour, twisting mockery back on others, being as lowly and gruesome as he's said to be in his drinking and rudeness and endless sex. Not that it is necessarily gruesome, but that's how it's seen, you know. I suspect even his very impulsive need for pleasures are a defence of their own too, and then also being more of that monstrous image in the darker, crueler sense of the word. Yeah, I am that monster, so what? That sense of liberation I talked about. Freeing yourself from having to care about who you are in a way that doesn't actually free you so much as just suppress your resentment about yourself. By embracing the person he's accused of being, he shuts himself off from the projection, but also at no point really comes to terms with himself. It doesn't resolve the burning part of Tyrion that hates himself for not being tall, for not being someone that people wouldn't be able to vilify. Which is why Penny is a great example of the very difficult but better journey he could take towards something slightly happier. What we do know anyway is a stage performance Arya watches of Westeros with a very devious, stereotypical image of Tyrion taking the stage. A version of Tyrion that fails to show all of the humanity at his centre that we've come to know and like him for, yet also paints a stark image of the sort of person he is becoming. Which here could feel like a good place to conclude the video, but there's more I want to say. This video has already been quite haphazard and all over the place, which can happen when you're talking about a person, a character, because people themselves are haphazard and a bit all over the place. If you're honing someone down to a clear defining point, you're probably missing something, you know? All the same, this video may be about to get even more haphazard. Are you ready? Whilst quite different methods, arming yourself against your vulnerabilities is exactly what Tywin does. Tyrion takes on that lesson and it leaves him massively conflicted throughout the story. On the one hand, he hates his father for the way he treats Tyrion, he hates his sister for the way she treats him, and the general world of the Highborn too. The general world of everyone, I guess. He's a child who dreams of owning a dragon, who would start fires deep below Casterly Rock and pretend he was a lost Targaryen prince with his own dragon. A boy who just wishes he belonged to a different family, I think. A very common wish children can have, such as the sort of story Harry Potter taps into, which I talked about in my wish fulfillment video here. You know, I don't seem to fit in with his family, I don't much like them or want to fit in necessarily either. With the exception of Jaime and my uncle, they seem horrible. I'll dream of some other family where I do actually belong. Maybe I'm just here as a mistake, maybe I'll find there's another family that wants me, or maybe I'll find I'm a Targaryen, the greatest family of all, and I'll end up being revered. The Lannisters would have to look up to me then, rather than the other way around. Wanting to have an identity set apart from this House Lannister where he doesn't belong, and partly doesn't want to belong either. And part of this hatred then fuels vengeance. He imagines burning his father and his sister with dragonfire. He enjoys enraging his sister, feeding her hurt and paranoia, even when it leads to bad consequences for him, just as he enjoys mocking his father. Knowing full well how his father hates mockery, it's the best revenge he's able to really exact. An impulsive, flippant throw of wit, which also makes Tywin feel a little less scary in his eyes, I suspect. When Tyrion is afraid of Tywin, particularly when he was young, finding ways to mock his father would ease some of that fear, make Tywin seem a little less towering and impossibly powerful, until eventually, that is, Tyrion realises he doesn't have to fear him, he can kill him. That actually Tywin is just as flawed and hypocritical and exactly like Tyrion himself, which I'll get onto in a second. So yeah, on the one hand he hates his family and wants revenge, same as he wants revenge against this general society. When he can't exact revenge on his powerful father or even directly his sister, he exacts it on weaker targets like Janos Slynt and Pycelle. And then on the other hand he wants his father's approval, which also makes sense. If Tywin is the central figure for all of this shame and humiliation that Tyrion is made to feel, and you obviously hate Tywin for making you feel that, winning his approval would make all the shame come to an end. It would not just remove it, but also somewhat resolve all of the past Tyrion was put through, or at least be imagined to resolve and stop it. So he's caught in this weird space of hating Tywin, but also feeling dependent upon him, desperate to win his affection, hence his eagerness to learn from Tywin and try to emulate him. If my father could see just how much I'm actually like Tywin, maybe then he'll love me. Except, in Tywin's case, he probably wouldn't. The more Tyrion is like him, the more it horrifies Tywin to be confronted with who he actually is himself. Therefore, the more he'd need to resist that realisation. Which ultimately means Tyrion can't win there. Being like his father doesn't work, and he's also too dependent to actually just break away healthily in a way that would probably be the best for him. Doubly difficult to break away when he financially depends entirely on being a Lannister. If it wasn't for the Lannister name and riches, he would have absolutely no power at all, so then he is very much caught between wanting to be a Lannister and not wanting to be a Lannister, and not able to do anything there really. And then there's where the feelings of good and bad come into all of this, wanting to prove to himself and to the world that he's not the monster, but that's intricately tied to winning his father's approval and being like him, which kind of means becoming the monster, so that's very confused. And then comes with a level of guilt for wanting to be like his father at all, a guilt he largely chooses to suppress. Wanting to be praised by others, but also wanting to exact revenge on them, feeling pity for outcasts, but not often true empathy. A desperation to believe in love, and that he is worthy of love, and even just of existence, but also a great and bitter anger when he feels that desperation to believe has been tricked. Tyrion is a vast array of complex, confused feelings to which your head would just spin in his situation. I don't find it at all surprising he's as impulsive as he is in that context. At least there's then something he can grapple onto, sex and wine and things. Although the sex is really more a search for intimacy and company and acceptance, and the drunkenness probably shuts off a lot of this hurricane of feelings. Tyrion's conclusion for everything is somewhat correct. He is a victim. He has been on trial his whole life for being a dwarf and various other things. A trial where his abusive father is quite fittingly the judge. I am the victim, and if that makes me a monster, then I'm a victim for being turned into that as well. At the same time, the only way out of feeling victimised is to take on a level of agency and responsibility to try and change. To not be powerless against these pressures, something it is very, very hard to do without support and someone believing in him. How do you learn to believe in yourself when nobody else believed in you to begin with? No wonder he wanted to believe Shay loved him. No wonder he wants to believe he can find Tysha again. I said it would have been a revelation to discover Lord Tywin Lannister isn't this invincible, imposing figure, but a devious hypocrite who sleeps with Shay and probably other women and doesn't, in the end, shit gold. I don't know if that's a good revelation or not. On the one hand, it gives Tyrion a feeling of power over his father, and it gives him some sense of understanding of who he really is. But on another level, it proves he is exactly like his dad, exactly like this man he hates. How do you then come to terms with yourself realising you're exactly like the person you most hate? Doubly hard to believe you can be anything different when your similarity is laid out so clearly in that moment. What does killing his father represent? I suppose you could argue it's killing off the part of Tyrion that is like his dad, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's very Oedipal. In killing Tywin, he can finally take up his own place as Tywin, for good or ill. It wasn't really an experience that gave him closure, just fed his vengeance and the intoxicating power he gains from it, I think. I guess I wanted to finish this video saying Tyrion's story paints a very real and horrifying struggle many of us do go through, the fear that we might turn into our parents, even when we hate everything they stand for. And I think it's made doubly scary because there will be times where we recognise themselves in us and we might act out in all sorts of the ways they used to, and those situations scare us. But we don't have to be and shouldn't expect to be absolutely nothing like our parents. We don't have to be total opposites to them. If we can forgive ourselves for some of our similarities, for the times we are similar, then we can give ourselves trust and confidence and the belief to be different, I think. Sometimes we'll get things wrong, but that doesn't mean we are doomed, certainly not if we're aware enough to spot when it happens. And when I talk about forgiving ourselves, I don't mean just going, oh, it's fine, that happened, and forgetting it. I mean going, that wasn't good, no, I can be honest to myself about that without having to distance myself from it, but I can also trust myself to grow. We can forgive our faults far easier when we believe we have space to grow beyond them with time. If we can be aware enough and emotionally reflective enough to recognise the similarities, scary as it might be, and to reflect on that fear and the guilt and possible anger at ourselves and everything else. I think if we can do that and we can, sensibly think about what would help us grow, are there certain situations I struggle with in particular that might be better avoiding or getting support with? I don't know, that's a bit jumbled. There's a lot to it. I didn't want this to become a massive point when I'm supposed to be talking about Tyrion here. I just felt like, having talked for a long time about a potentially good person increasingly turning into his abusive father, I just wanted to say that doesn't have to be the story for everyone. I didn't want to give that impression. It might not even be the story for Tyrion. We don't know where George R.R. Martin is going with things, how it's going to end. I will be fascinated to find out. So, sorry this was all over the place, even more so than my videos usually are. There's just so much to say, and it's hard to put it all into clear points. As I said before, I am not a Song of Ice and Fire book nerd. I've only very recently read them for the first time, so please add your more informed thoughts in the comments. Those of you who know more than me, let me know what I missed and what I got wrong and what I got right. All the same, if you enjoyed this, give it a like, subscribe if you want more Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire analysis, and other analysis videos, anything that I do. I've done quite a bit on this channel. Support me on Patreon if you want help to keep this channel going as well, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time.
And as ever, a special thank you goes to Janice McMahon, Luke Orr, ChrichuKB, Michael Gallagher, In Squares, Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier and Chad Bramwell. Thank you.